on a scale of 1 to 10, I suppose I would have been a 9 because I was in a secure institutional environment. But I was fortunate to have good people who worked in the orphanage that were really good, were really good people, were out for my interests. And so in that sense, and the advice I would try to give him is, if I was to be talking to my younger self, was to try and be more secure and not to. I was very needy at that age, but I was, and that neediness was obviously fed because of the rejection that I felt from my mother, even though I suppose at that age I wasn't aware of it, because I was that was the world I knew, and that was the world I was secure in. But when I went to live with my biological mother, and my stepfather, that was just such a transition, and it was a culture shock because I was predominantly brought up in a white environment with the people that were raising me were white, and so they wouldn't have, and in those days didn't know how to relate. They had no knowledge of black people or of their food, their culture, how we feel and how we think. So I was in one sense. So I thought like a white person, and it was not until I went. So the positive side of it was when I went to live with my mother. I realised that I'm black, and even though I had to get used to the food, and I went to a black school, Tulsa School, which was right in Brixton. So most of the kids that went to the school were black, and it was just so that culture shock, coming to face with my own culture. So I had that to deal with. But then going back at the home, to answer your question, Shai, was that I just needed to be secure. And even though I was in a secure environment, I was still very insecure and very needy because I wasn't being nurtured by, my real mother. And well, I don't know of my father. My mother's told me stories about my father, and she said that one minute she said she was in love with him, and now she's trying to say that she was raped by him. So that's caused another issue. But I know my answer might seem muddled, but if I was to talk to another young man who's in a home or who's being cared for by foster carers, I'd want him to try and get in touch with himself in terms of not to reject therapy, not to reject anything, where try and get a role model or someone who you could look up to, particularly a black male role model who's going to give him a good, positive, masculine affirmation. There'd be so much that I would want to, like nurture to him, so that he doesn't sort of go down the path of, criminality or anything where he feels that he's going to get attention, love, and because a lot of the young black guys now, they're getting into it, and I'm not saying all, because I think the media exaggerates it, but a lot of them are into the gang life because that's their family, that's their, who they relate to and who they can connect with. And that, that's why I feel a lot of them are, because a lot of them, you'll find a lot of them are, they don't have a good positive male role model in their lives. A lot of them are brought up by single women who are struggling and trying to, just trying to find a way of bringing them up the best way they know, and it becomes a vicious circle. So that's a real deep question, and I don't know if I can answer it fully, but I think that's the advice I would give. So I don't know if I've answered that, Shai, but yeah.
Amazing. I mean, like everything you're saying and how you're explaining it, even what you just said, how, multi-dimensional your experience has been and the transition you've gone through. And one thing I want to try and kind of hone in on is your transition from going from that 9 space when you're in that home to you being with, your biological mother, and more importantly, what that experience was like. If we can just get a bit more understanding of what the whole context of, how your feeling was, the relationships that was in that household, because again, that wasn't just a house, it also became your new home now. And that also brought a lot of different struggle from, again, you've got the culture, the culture struggles, you've got the emotional safety, you've also got the relationship you have with your mother, and not having that affection and love that you're most probably not aware of at that age, but it's, at the same time you can feel something's not right, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, I can look back to that clearly. Actually, I remember when because I had a social worker, because each child in the orphanage was assigned a social worker, and the social service at that time felt it's time for me to go and live with my mother. I had been going on the odd weekend because I was living in Woodford Bridge. That's where the orphanage was, and I was going from the age of 12. I was travelling from on the outskirts of East London to South London to spend the weekends with my mum and my stepfather. And after a couple of years of doing that, and it wasn't every weekend, it was sort of like every other weekend, and anyway, to make a long story short, when I got to the age of 14, they felt that it was time for me to they felt it was the right time for me to go and live with my mother and stepfather, because there wasn't a reason for me to stay in the home anymore, because they felt, I suppose, that they was using it as a familiarity sort of, it was one of their methods of trying to get children back into their family unit. So, and the couple that were looking after me in the children's home had retired, but the lady that had been constantly in my life, Jill Snowlin, she had moved to Ipswich. So when I eventually did move into my home with my mother, at first it was really, I couldn't sleep. I would rock myself to sleep because I was really mentally and emotionally disturbed, to the point where it concerned my stepfather, which was surprising because he didn't really show any sort of affection or love to me. Even, you know, my mother was, because of her strict religious ways, I think she was more concerned about image rather than nurturing this disturbed 14-year-old boy. And so I was told to change my name because my name on my birth certificate was Leroy Anthony Johnson Gale. And when I went to live with my mother, I was always known as Tony anyway, because they'd always I was always known by my middle name. And even though my mother called me Anthony, but all my friends and people who I got to know just called me Tony because they shortened the name. Anyway, so when I eventually was living there, I was always trying to get my mother's approval and always doing things, and because I was scared of her in the sense because I didn't know her, and I just saw her as this sort of authoritative, because she comes across as very authoritative, very sort of not maternal, and so I was always afraid of her. And my stepfather was always on my back about things which bugged him, and like as soon as I got up in the morning, have you washed out your mold? That's the first thing you would ask me, rather than, oh, how are you? Did you sleep well? First thing you'd ask me is, have you washed out your mold? And because he was like, you could say, the typical stereotypical black man that doesn't know how to relate to their kids.
I think that's a common thing with the older generation, or was.
Yeah, that sort of generation, and you just, I remember I was about 16 once, and I said to him, and at that time I called him Dad, and I said, Dad, do you love me? What are you talking about? Just wash the dishes, man. And don't talk to me about this foolishness. And it was, so it wasn't. There was no sort of, like, because I say to my kids now, I love you, son, and I love you, Josh, to the point where Joshua said, well, why are you saying that? I know you love me, and I'm not afraid to hug him or kiss him, and the same with Daniel, but yeah, so it was just that. It was just, I couldn't be myself, and I just felt estranged with my mother, estranged with my stepmother, and it was. But I felt, fortunately, I started to make friends in church, and it's with that family who I eventually went to live with, who were, they were old school, but they were new school in the sense that, Mr. and Mrs. May, they were very, they broke the mold in that sense. You could go and talk to them, you could go and hug them, you could kiss them, it was, and yet they were old school in the terms of like discipline. There's some things you wouldn't dare say to Mrs. May because she was the disciplinarian. She would chase you around the room with a broom if you dare backchat her. It was that sort. But she was a loving woman. And but going back to that sort of the culture shock, living with my mother and my stepfather, it was very difficult, and I could say that I was very unhappy. Yeah. I don't know if that's answered the question. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Uh, wow, just wow, man.
Mhm.
There's so much there that I feel like, firstly, it's just to say I'm really proud of you and how far you've come and how you spoke about perseverance earlier on, and that's something that is coming through. I suppose when life keeps making you feel like you have to keep persevering, you might not appreciate how much you've persevered through because it's sort of ongoing. But there is so much there. And even that contrast of being able to see that currently with all you have, with the loving family, with how far you've progressed and all these things, you feel like you're at a 6. And when you look back, then you'd say that young man was at a 9. And it is to some extent that resilience that young people have, resiliency that young people have, and that different outlook. It's almost like life keeps beating us up for so long. The
Mm.
number is usually going to go down. This the friend, you say you moved in with Mr. and Mrs. Mayhew, was it?
Mayhew, yeah.
Mayhew.
Mayhew, yeah.
Mayhew. Was that, you said, through a friend initially?
Yeah, well, because Andrew Mayhew, I could class him as my best friend now,
Yeah.
and he's married. His mother, well, I call her our mother really. Mrs. May, she died um, in October 8 years ago. Yeah, it was 8 years ago. Yeah, and then
Sorry.
Mr. May died a couple of months ago. He was 94. Mrs. May was in her 80s when she died. But it's that generation that's gone now. So yeah, went to live with them, and just because Andrew's around my age group, so is Carlton, who um, oh, it's funny because Carlton is the same age as me, and we were more friends. But Carlton lives in America now. He lives in California with his wife, and he's got 3 boys. And they've got an older brother, Tony Mayhew, and 2 older sisters, Sadie and Ika. But yeah, but they were a good. They're a good, strong family. But like all families, you have your issues and your ups and your downs. But yeah.
I'm wondering what the conversation was like as well, because if you're currently, say at the time, with your mother and her and father-in-law or stepfather, sorry, and you then have a conversation with your friend Andrew, and now you're going to move into their home for a period before you sort of start moving on to the next phase of your life. It's what was the kind of conversation like? I don't know, with your mom or with with the Mayhews, like when you turn up, hey, can I crash for a while? Like, I,
Yeah,
how
yeah,
does
that's a
that
good
go?
question. Yeah, yeah. I remember the day. It was in the summer. I was in my early, late teens, well, I was in my 20s, and it got to a point where I was getting too big to be beaten, because my stepfather would, he couldn't, and because he knows that I would have all that repressed anger. He knows I would have.
Ready to unleash.
Yeah, we know when we sense danger.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I just remember saying to my mother that I'm I'm gonna go and live with the Mayhews. Um, I know it upset her, but she knew there was nothing that she could say or do that would stop me. And I remember going that afternoon to Mrs. Mayhew and saying, "Is it all right if I stay here for a while?" And she was happy because she treated me like one of her own, and she was happy. But she said, Well, I have to ask, she called him Carpy. That was his nickname. I have to ask Carpy, and then I'll let you know, so that evening I came, she said, well, Mr. Mayor said it's all right. And she said, this is, these are the rules of the house, blah, blah, blah. But I'd already sort of really knew because I was spending a lot of time there anyway. And and I just got my stuff, and I didn't have much stuff. It was just clothes and a few belongings. And then I moved in with the Mayhews. And it was just, and where was I? I wasn't working at the time. I was unemployed, but and it was just, but I had a little part-time job, sorry, at Sainsbury's, and because at that time I was thinking of becoming a youth worker, and I was doing an access course, but that fell through. But I was trying to sort of figure out where am I going to go in life, what am I going to do, and how am I going to, what is really my, I suppose you could call it a calling, or in terms of jobs and things like that. So, but I suppose with the Mayhews, it was more, I think, if looking back on it now, they gave me a sort of a good mental and emotional bedrock, as to where I'm gonna go in life. And I think that's a very important thing. Is wherever you are, whoever you are, you just need to try and get that emotional and mental and even spiritual bedrock, and try and discover who you are and where you want to go. Yeah.
That's beautiful. I feel like that's definitely what comes next right now. I think you talk us through some of those mental, emotional, physical, psychological, spiritual. We go through that. And I think before I hand over to you to carry on, or for Ray to jump in there, what's also, I think, come to mind for me is this idea of, for someone listening, they might need to have a conversation with their child or with the person who's in the house, with some of the things you've described, like not being able to fall asleep. And it takes even your stepfather, who wasn't the most connected to you, seeing that. It feels like that's definitely something to consider. Just because someone's in the home and it's your roof, your rules, we've got the cliche of you're not their friend, you're their parent and everything. Sometimes, yes, you can, that way could work, but there might need to be a conversation that just needs to be had with, are you okay? How did you sleep? I think that was such a powerful, simple thing there. Like, you talked about being a needy kid, but it's like, it's not really. It's like, I wake up, I just want someone to ask me if I'm okay, not just, have you washed your mouth out? Like, just, am I okay? But you can see how someone can become needy because you're not getting any of this. So firstly, it's just that I feel like, for someone listening, either you need to let somebody in the house know that we should have a conversation, or hopefully this is a parent listening as well, and maybe it's time to just have a quick conversation, a quick check if everyone's okay. Or even if you're not a parent, just ask the other person in the house how they're doing. So I thought that was really, really important, really key. And the second thing I think that was really just phenomenal for me is, often our communities, like you hinted at earlier as well, are painted in one way, in a very negative way. And here we have this just lovely example of compassion, of caring, of embracing someone and treating them like your own. This it goes to the core. A lot of our guests have said it, where we take each other like family. Like, you've been there so often, and they open their home to you, and you're there for a couple of years, you're sorting yourself out. It gave you this space. Like, that's not spoken about as much when it comes to our community. So I thank you especially for just highlighting that happens. It wasn't adoption papers were signed. It was just come through and this is your home. And it goes to that thing when they call you son, like they mean son. And when you say this was now Grandma Ipswich, this was really Grandma Ipswich, you know?
Yeah, you're right.
So that was amazing. And yeah, so I wanted to highlight those because they really stood out for me. And it's brought us to a beautiful place where you can now talk about the psychological, mental, spiritual, emotional growth and exploration that came after. But yeah.